As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
But in space, there are actually very clear connotation of what sustainability means. So from one perspective, sustainability means that we are going to utilize space, those nations that are able to, in a way that is going to be not destructive of space.
Aloha, and welcome to Dialogue, where conversations shape security. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's a pleasure to have you join us for Dialogue 33, Sustainability and Responsibility in Space. Space is no longer the exclusive realm of governments and scientists. It's the invisible backbone of our interconnected world, a bustling marketplace of innovation and a critical domain for national security. But this increasing reliance on space comes at a cost. Every launch, every maneuver, and every collision generates debris, turning our orbital highways into a minefield of high-speed projectiles. Even a tiny paint flick can cripple a satellite or threaten the lives of astronauts, and the consequences are far-reaching. Disrupted communications, economic losses, and even the potential for escalating tensions between nations. But the challenges go beyond debris. As more nations and companies stake their claim in space, competition for limited resources intensifies. The lack of clear rules and norms risks turning this shared domain into a zone of mistrust and potential conflict. The good news is that we have a choice. We can choose cooperation over competition, sustainability over exploitation. The International Space Station stands as a testament to what we can achieve when we work together. Agreements like the 1968 Outer Space Treaty provides a foundation for peaceful use and exploration. But we need to go further. This is a defining moment for space. We need to invest in innovative technologies to track and remove debris, develop stricter international regulations for responsible space operations, and design satellites with sustainability in mind. We need to foster dialogue and build trust among all spacefaring nations, recognizing that the long-term health of space is in everyone's interest. Today, we're privileged to have two experts join us to discuss these critical issues. Dr. Namrata Goswami, an author, professor, and consultant specializing in space policy and international relations, and Sam Wilson, a senior policy analyst at the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. He focuses on space security and sustainability. Our moderator today is Dr. Alfred Oehlers, a professor here at DKI APCSS. Namrata, Sam, and Al, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much, James, for that wonderful welcome and helping us frame the topic that we're going to be addressing here today as well, too. I think you posed it in exactly the right sort of terms, that this has been a landscape that has witnessed tremendous rapid growth, but there are risks, very important inherent risks that are associated with this space endeavor that we are embarking on, and to which we need to pay very, very urgent attention. I like the use of the word that we're standing at a critical threshold, because we can move in very different directions as we move forward here. And we're so lucky to be joined by two preeminent experts in this particular field to help us move forward. The whole notion around sustainability and responsibility, of course, is not something new. We've been talking about this for quite a long period of time. And in fact, it has energized lately a lot of international attention, particularly around UN processes. The UN, for example, has established an open-ended working group to examine the issue of responsibility and sustainability in space. And we're so gratified as well, too, that at a regional level, the Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum has taken upon itself to adopt this as the principal theme it addressed last week at their 30th Asia Pacific Regional Space Agencies Forum, APRSAF, meeting in Perth in Australia. They chose to adopt the theme, collaborating to build a sustainable and responsible regional space sector. And I would like to offer a very, very warm welcome to the delegates from that meeting who will be joining us today, but also, of course, to our audience from DKI APCSS that have been faithfully following this wonderful series of talks. I'd like to go back now to our two guests. I think for many in our audience, they will immediately recognize Namrata Goswami, a very well-known independent senior analyst that have been writing on this topic for a very long period of time and published extensively as well too. But also Sam Wilson from the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation that has been working on these topics, but also these topics as they relate to the Indo-Pacific. So Sam is a very seasoned expert that has been examining these issues through the lens of South Korea, Singapore, other emerging space powers in the Indo-Pacific. And it's through these two experts that we're going to be able to get a deeper look into some of the things that are at stake. So without further ado, what I'd like now is to turn to our panel and offer them a number of questions to consider and respond to, and we'll carry the conversation forward for a period of time before we turn over to audience Q&A. So to start off, Namrata, I'd like to start with you if you don't mind. I don't want to put you on the spot there, but I know that you've been watching this issue very, very carefully over these years. Now, Namrata, when we think about a word such as sustainability, for many in our audience, sustainability is a term that we normally associate with things such as environmental change or economic development. In its usage in a space context, what exactly are we talking about here?
Sure. Thank you, Al, for that question, and thank you for having me, and delighted to be with Sam. So when we think about the word sustainability in space, you rightly started with that because that can sometimes lead to confusion because, as you said, it's very much connected to the environmental movement. But in space, there are actually very clear connotation of what sustainability means. So from one perspective, sustainability means that we are going to utilize space, those nations that are able to, in a way that is going to be not destructive of space. It's going to keep space, for example, low Earth orbit in a way that others can use it. So by that, what it means is that, and this is a very important perspective because this also informs the debate at the United Nations, different agencies that look at space. And you pointed to that with the open-ended working group that's talking about how we can encourage responsible behavior. So it's connected to the notion of responsibility. And so sustainability means that the access to space in that particular perspective remains free, remains capable, and also remains without some of the concerns, for example, like space debris. So space debris is a big issue in that particular connotation. And so the aspiration and the security dimension of this is that while nations develop capability like counter space, the usage of kinetic anti-satellite weapons that create, for example, human-made debris, natural debris, all these play into that concept of sustainability. Now, this is the more larger normative dimension of sustainability, but there are also two other dimensions. So the second dimension of sustainability that goes to the nation state. So when I talked about the first dimension, that's at the global level, as well as the regional level. You just talked about Japan. So that is how space is viewed. Keep it free, keep it like a sanctuary that it's being, that will be able to be used by others. The second view of sustainability is a national conceptualization, which actually looks at it from the economic perspective. So this is a very critical discourse around the world today, which is that nations are looking to develop space. We started with the critical point that this is the defining moment of space. So what's happening today is that nations are hoping to utilize space technology that they can use for the development of their societies around the world, not just those nations that can go to space, but also those nations in the Indo-Pacific, in Africa, in Latin America, that can utilize satellites to develop their critical capabilities. For that, you need an economic, sustainable model. So the very important dimension of this notion is that when we think about developing a satellite program or a launch capability, then that has to be sustainable in the long term, by which they mean the costs of developing that particular program should not be so much that the value that you get in return is actually not, it does not justify the cost. An example could be for NASA. Let's get to a very developed nation, the United States. So if NASA develops a space program, and if the cost is very high, the ability to sustain it because you are using taxpayer money, you have to get it funded by Congress, goes down. So there is that dimension of sustainability as well. And then the final dimension is a very interesting dimension. I think I should bring it to bear, is that first dimension is very normative. It's about access, humanity's access to space, a global good. The second dimension is economic, commercial, that a nation that does not have that kind of funding, say, for example, that China or the US has, can still develop their space program. So sustainability is also looked through economic development perspective. But then the final perspective is a really interesting perspective. It intersects between civil, commercial, and military. And this is the idea of sanctuary. So the idea of sanctuary is in the civil and commercial space, it's about keeping space pristine. It's about keeping space for science and exploration. It's about ensuring that space remains such that we can study space, but we are not going to destroy it. That's the idea of the sanctuary that comes into sustainability as well. And then there is a military dimension, and I'll end there. So in the concept of space power developed by David Lupton, he pointed out that there is also the concept of sanctuary in the military literature that talks about keeping space peaceful and sustainable so that you can utilize space for overflight rights. So a nation can use space for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, for arms control, treaty verification. And what is fascinating is that in that discourse, countries that have nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction see that capability as absolutely vital for global stability. Because without that kind of knowledge, you can have misperceptions of another nation, what they're doing with their weapons of mass destruction. And so there you go. There are all these different dimensions of sustainability in the literature.
That's wonderful, Namrata. Thank you for walking us through all the nuances there. It certainly gives us a far deeper appreciation right now about this whole sustainability discussion that is happening in relation to space. Sam, I'm going to turn over to you now, Sam. And, when we take a look at the term responsibility, I kind of think about the maritime sector, and I think about aviation and how the term responsibility and due regard, for instance, are made use of to try to provide some semblance of rules around operations in those domains. Am I on the right track when we think about responsibility in space being similar to that usage?
Thanks, Al. And before I begin, I just want to note, like Namrata, thanks for inviting us. Thanks for having me. I look forward to every year getting to share the virtual stage with you and Namrata. And before, it's a really interesting question. And before giving you a likely unsatisfactory answer, especially following Namrata, I just want to note that these issues are so important, and it's such a good time to be thinking about them. In the Cold War, space was dominated by a few major governmental powers. That has changed fundamentally. Now there are over 70 countries that own or operate satellites in orbit. There are over 60 countries that have their own national space programs. Over 12 countries, or around 12 countries, can independently launch into orbit. And it's not just governmental players who are operating in space. It's also private players. In fact, most of the active satellites in orbit are owned by private companies. So you have this complexity of who's operating in space and what space actors look like. And then you also have this added factor of just the sheer increase in activity. Since I've been working in the Center for Space Policy and Strategy over the last 6 years, the number of spacecraft has more than tripled, right? And it's set to triple again. And so you have not only such a diversity of players and types of players, but you have so much more activity and spacecraft in orbit to navigate and to think through. So these questions become harder, but also more important. So with that, I would just note that responsibility can mean a lot of different things, right? And Namrata walked through all the different dimensions of sustainability. Responsibility can mean responsible launch. It can mean responsible satellite operations. It could mean responsible disposal of your aircraft. It could mean responsible behaviors. In 2021, the United Kingdom introduced a UN resolution that sought to establish an open-ended working group that would make recommendations on possible norms for responsible behaviors relating to threats to space to space systems. I think this is really, really important, right? And we're going to talk probably about the civil aspects of this, the commercial aspects, but the national security aspects are really important. And along those lines, the U.S. government in 2022 announced a pledge not to carry out destructive direct ascent ASAT missile tests, because that would create more debris and make it harder for states to operate. Going to your angle on aviation and maritime, I definitely think there are really important lessons there and things to pull on. A colleague of mine at the beginning of last year wrote a paper on applying the Convention on the International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea, what's called coal regs, to space. And while not all the rules in coal regs apply well to the space domain, several rules and principles I think could be extracted to help identify some of the collision risks that could be important for outer space. And I think it's really valuable for just thinking through the questions that we need to answer for space. If there's a potential collision or an approach that seems dangerous, who should be maneuvering and in which ways, and how should they, and what should determine the threshold for a maneuver? Is it based on is it based on distance? Is it based on other factors? Is it based on the potential for orbits, especially in low Earth orbit where you have orbits intersect, right? Potential for two orbits to intersect. So anyway, there's all these really interesting questions that we need to pull on as we start trying to figure out these rules, these behaviors, these mundane concepts for trying to prevent collisions in space. Because right now, the sad truth is that there's very little space traffic management, let alone and there's little even space traffic coordination, right? So getting to management, especially as the domain continues to become more complex and busier, I think is going to be pressing.
Thank you very much, Sam. All you've done there is complexify something that I had already been very confused about. So you've done a great job. Now, let me go back to Namrata now. Look, Namrata, we've heard from you, we've heard from Sam, and it does seem that we are confronted with a perplexing array of perspectives on what these two terms mean. Now, could I put it to you? Am I being naive in expecting that we could generate consensus in understanding these two terms? I mean, in our current geopolitical environment, for example, do countries see eye to eye on these two issues? Over to you.
That's a great question to tackle. So, and thank you, Sam, for that and setting the stage. So I think when I want to respond to that question, I'm trying to think through the cases and the examples where there is room for hope. So there are three issues that nations, including those that are geopolitically not aligned, for example, with different systems, are viewing. One is, of course, the importance of ensuring that low Earth orbit, where the debris is the most dangerous, there is some level of mapping of that particular debris. So one of the contentions I have in my research is that while we have these, these virtual displays on the globe of debris, they're not very scientific because they're not very clear as to the size of the debris. Debris is moving very fast. And of course, when you track it, if you want to do anything about a debris hitting a satellite, you have to be able to send a signal in real time to a particular satellite. And Sam pointed out, maneuvering, changing the delta V of a satellite will require a lot of fuel, right? So we are still not designed for that today. So there is a consensus among nations that that is something that probably would be required. It would require different design. It would require our ability to be able to have fuel to move the delta V of satellites. So all that is in consensus. The second critical thing where I see some level of thinking that's coming together, if not at the national security level, but at least at the security, space security at the UN level. So there's a little difference there. So when you talk about space security at the United Nations level, the UN is thinking in terms of securing space assets, enabling nations to talk and dialogue, the whole notion of coming together to form some level of consensus. So in that particular context, there is a growing recognition that we might need something in the future because of nations developing this low Earth orbit constellations that consist of thousands and thousands of satellites. I mean, 30,000, 40,000, which means you will require some level of space traffic management, which Sam pointed out. And I would say that when you look at history, despite nations disagreeing a lot, including to the extent of having conflict, they agreed on air traffic management, right? There is some level of international global understanding. That's why we're all able to travel. So I think that is something where there is hope. And then finally, I think when you think about space sustainability and responsibility, there is, of course, a growing conversation, if not a consensus, that maybe nations need to think very seriously about, for example, a weapon like an anti-satellite weapon. So the UN, of course, has come up with a resolution supported by several nations. Sam mentioned the US, declaring a unilateral moratorium on anti-satellite weapon testing. So there is growing recognition of that, despite the fact that we had nations like China, India, and then Russia testing those weapons, not in the distant past, right? But even within those countries, there is this conversation that, especially China and India that I study, that we need to be very, very careful in what we do going forward, and we need to develop space in such a way that does not create this global backlash. So there is room for hope.
Wonderful. Thank you for that reassurance, Namrata. And I'm going to give Sam now a chance to recoup some of the damage that he's done before in my confusion. Because of course, Namrata, nation states are one set of very important players in space, but Sam alluded to a whole range of new players now to include, of course, commercial space. So there are some differences in perspective, I suspect, between civil, military, and commercial space. And I wanted to pull on the thread that you offered there, Sam. I mean, if we were to focus on these three different sets of players now, is there room for building consensus between them, given their very different agendas and incentive systems? Over to you.
Yeah, incentives for creating sustainable or responsible behaviors. Yeah. I mean, I think what Namrata said is absolutely right. I think that last point is worth just foot stomping. Like, even when countries are in conflict, and even when there's serious tensions, there's been enough cooperation to set things like air traffic management and air traffic control. And for civil, national security, commercial, I think these terms can get interpreted differently, right? Like when I think of commercial, they may think of sustainability in terms of the sustainability of the space operational environment. broadly. They may think of it in terms of sustainable operations that they're carrying out, regardless of what's happening with respect to the broader space environment. Or they might be thinking about their business models, whether they're sustainable, right? So you have a spectrum of these terms. But I do think that there are some things, there's some aspects that we should all be agreeing to. It's just, I think there's a convergence of objectives. We just need to sort out the means to achieve those objectives. But we need to do it soon because, as we've talked about, right, the space operational environment is just becoming so much busier. I think it was different, 5 years ago than it was today, and it's certainly 5 years from now. We're really going to need to, to be more proactive with kind of figuring out how we can collaborate and cooperate to manage this level of traffic.
Wonderful. Thank you. You kind of partly redeemed yourself there, Sam, but I'm going to give both of you a chance now to leave me in a really optimistic mood, because by nature, I am a very optimistic person. I'd like to leave with something that we can hang on to. And Namrata, you've mentioned traffic management as one area that perhaps would be very productive in terms of building consensus and cooperation and collaboration going forward with respect to sustainability and responsibility. Sam, you've also built on that to offer a few additional thoughts. But if I were to ask you to just maybe nominate one really good example that for you encapsulates, in addition to those things that you have mentioned here, the prospect of making good ground on fostering greater sustainability and responsibility in space, what would you nominate in the Indo-Pacific? Over to you, Namrata.
Yeah, so I think when I think about the Indo-Pacific, what I would actually nominate is this focus on building institutional memory, right? So, and I say this with the kind of research I've done. What I'm noticing is that especially those nations that are having the space capability today, like launch, building satellites, and then also building institutional structures and strengthening their institutional structures. So I can take the example of China on one hand, I can take the example of Japan, I can take the example of India, ASEAN nations. So what is so interesting to me is that before, as Sam was mentioning, during the Cold War, these nations were interested, but not to the level, say, like the US or the Soviet Union, who build extensive institutional structures. And by institutional structures, I mean policy, which is really important as to what the focus of their missions are, international collaboration and partnerships, identifying challenges and issues. And then finally, not just that, the desire to build their internal civil commercial structures that enable that. And by that, I mean funding. Funding is vital for building these capabilities. So what I noticed in the Indo-Pacific, I'll end with this example, is that there is a growing conversation among the nations, not just the spacefaring nations, but those who want to take advantage of this activity, that there is a real need to enable space to remain accessible as well as clean of debris. There's a great convergence. And because of that, what is happening is that you have commercial entities that are trying to build technologies that will be able to deal with the space debris problem, right? So they're starting to invest in that. India came up with policies recently talking about how important this is, how they want to enable the commercial sector. Japan is one. Singapore talks about it at a very high level. And so what is fascinating is that the recognition is not just that, as Sam was mentioning, we need to do it now. That recognition is a case that I would point out to, because I noticed not just a continuous talking about the fact that space debris is a problem, but actually a desire to fund research and development that enables the ability to clean up debris in low Earth orbit, and if possible, beyond. And I'll finally end by saying that if you listen to the narratives coming out of the Indo-Pacific, the moon is also included in this. So it's just not limited to Earth orbit, like low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit, but there's also a lot of conversation about how we need to be much more sustainable in the way we are actually going to utilize the moon, because there is recognition that the resources on the moon, like helium-3 or water ice, are not unlimited. There is a limit to it, and that's where I'll end with a hope and an optimism.
Great. Thank you so much, Namrata. Well, Sam, over to you now. You've been traveling through Japan, South Korea, Singapore. You've been writing about these places. Have you uncovered any additional example here that we can think of?
Yeah, and I just want to note at the end of Namrata's response, she brought up the importance of the moon. It just reminded me, Namrata wrote a really excellent piece for us that was part of our debate series, and she participated in a debate. So I encourage folks who are interested in that topic to look that up, because Namrata was really excellent. So one of the things I think, I'll mention a couple of examples here, but I think space situational awareness, space domain awareness is an area for the Indo-Pacific that there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration, right? This is how, a country like the United States can try to lean on some of its allies and partners who have unique territories, right? And the geography, and leverage that geography to have a better mapping of what's happening in the space operational environment, including like what's happening with respect to like Chinese satellites, for example. So I think space situational awareness is a really big one, and I think that's going to continue to be a big one. And that's been an important area for U.S. Defense-based partnerships going back to the Cold War. Another I would note is hosted payloads. So the United States, the Department of Defense did something pretty historic a few months ago in August. It launched a Norwegian satellite that had an operational DoD national security payload on it. And it was the first time that DoD had done that, had launched a foreign satellite that had its own operational payload on it. And this reportedly saved the Space Force up to $900 million on what it would have cost if it had to build that satellite from scratch. So right now, I think one of the really important developments in national security space is in the United States, we're transitioning a lot of the defense missions from constellations of satellites that were few in number and big and expensive to now larger numbers of smaller, simpler spacecraft, right? And we're calling them proliferated sets of satellites. For missile warning, for example, the most recently deployed U.S. system for missile warning was SBIRS, Space-Based Infrared System. This was 6 satellites. For the next generation of systems, the budget documents a couple of years ago announced plans for over 150 satellites, right? So moving from a handful to between 100 and 200. I think this creates more opportunities for defense-based partnerships in which U.S. allies, including Japan and South Korea, can develop their own satellite, and we integrate U.S. national security payloads on those satellites. This is happening with the next round of Japanese satellites, the quasi-zenith satellite system. And I just think is a model that should be really attractive, particularly between the United States and some of its partners in the Asia Pacific. And then I'll just offer one note of, because I was sort of pessimistic in the beginning, and this relates to the Asia Pacific. I think even though there's so little coordination and collaboration between U.S. and China on just anything with respect to space, these are the two countries that have the most satellites in orbit, right? So if you're thinking about the countries that stand to lose the most from not kind of figuring out how do we work together, forget about conflict, just thinking about how do we ensure that your satellite doesn't collide with my satellite, or how should we coordinate if there is a threshold that we agree on is reached and there's a risk of a conjunction, a risk of a collision. There's just so much to lose there that I think that coordination has to happen, will happen. I just don't know when.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam, for that little reminder that we've got skin in the game here. So we better take heed of that. All right. Thank you so much to the both of you for contributing your thoughts to this discussion segment of the webinar. I have a much sterner test for you now, and that is to handle the audience questions that we've received during the course of the week preceding this webinar. And to help us walk through those questions, I'm going to turn to my colleague now, James Minnich, to talk to those questions and to invite you to respond. So back to James again, but thank you both very, very much.
Thank you very much for that, Al. We do have a series of questions. We'll see if we can go through them. There's some fantastic questions. I think we'll begin talking about, well, frankly, where you left off, Sam, and this is on space cooperation and global security. So I'll ask you this first, Sam, we'll go over to Namrata, but how can space cooperation among countries contribute to global peace and security? Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to think that cooperation in space doesn't necessarily mean terrestrial cooperation. And I think, even, the United States, up until 7-8 years ago was relying on Russian spacecraft to get its astronauts to the International Space Station. I don't think that necessarily turns into geopolitical changes on Earth. That's my I think that, however, that there's a lot of opportunity for trying to use space to in collaborative ways and to encourage collaboration in which we can see that this is mutually beneficial. But I struggle with it as a means to peace on Earth. And I'm interested in Namrata's thoughts on this. But I think that if we oversell the idea of what space collaboration can achieve, then we misconstrue what our objectives are, right? Our objectives, I think, of using Russian spacecraft to get to the International Space Station was because we didn't have an option to get our astronauts to the International Space Station, right? It wasn't to prevent Russia from carrying out hostile behavior, right? So we have to see that as a success in its own right, because it was for trying to encourage some of the objectives we had for ISS, not for U.S. Russian relations writ large.
Namrata, when you go to answer this, I'll have to tell you, I was really intrigued by your earlier question, which I think pulls on this, and that dealt with about how we have figured out in this airspace engagement how to keep from crashing into each other. And so we've been doing this for many decades. And so despite how challenging things are, we must cooperate there if we're going to be successful there. And I would assume you're thinking, at least in part of your response, how this can contribute to global peace and security. But over to you, Namrata.
Yeah, sure. So I think Sam did a great job, because I think when we think about, so the question is whether when you collaborate in space that contributes to global peace and security. So I'll touch on the air traffic management and what can we do to enable such a space traffic management, right? So I think it is really true that if you have conflicts on Earth, for example, China-India has a border dispute. And so in case China and India decides to collaborate on low Earth orbit, that does not necessarily mean that they might resolve that dispute, right? So that's, but that's, as Sam was pointing out, that geopolitical conflicts can still escalate despite the fact that you might be collaborating at the International Space Station. I think one way that some level of, say, weather forecasting, disaster response, that really contributes. So one nation with that capability can offer that kind of mapping to a nation that doesn't have it. And that can actually contribute to the repository of building human capacity. And that space is done. So you do contribute at some level to global peace and security. And the United Nations Spider program is a lot about that. How do you bring nations' capability to bear? Now, coming to the question that you asked about space traffic management, I think it is going to be incentive-based building of space traffic management. So we got air traffic management because we started using commercial planes. And if we are going to use commercial planes where we fly from one city to the other, and we as civilians who go on these planes pay for it, there has to be some level of regulatory assurance and consensus that you're not going to be shot down. right? And so it is in the incentive of every country on earth to enable travel for their own citizens that they agreed to this air traffic management, right? It is very much economic incentive based, but also safety and security based because their own citizens were involved. I think that future in space is coming. So because of the fact that unlike the Cold War, you now have commercial actors across the world building space capability. Look at the US, you have SpaceX with the most advanced launch capability and, as Sam was mentioning, satellite capability. China registered about 13,000 satellites. India is talking about building a low Earth orbit constellation. So I think it will be in the incentive of nations as they grow their commercial space industry and have assets in space that they will be forced by their own companies and their own citizens to come to some level of consensus because space is so much connected to national security, but so is airplanes, right? And so is air. So I think there will be some level of incentive-based space traffic management that will happen.
No, nicely said, both of you. Let's go to the next question then that's being asked. And this one is on universal space law. Question is simple. Is it possible to establish a space law that applies uniformly to all states worldwide? Now, you've alluded to this at different things. You talked about coal regs, you spoke, but I'd like you to pull on this a little bit further and see if you can answer this question.
Okay, so to answer that question, we already have space laws that are internationally agreed to. For example, you mentioned that in your opening statement, the Outer Space Treaty. So there are 110 nations that have signed on to the Outer Space Treaty, and those are binding because that's a treaty. That's not just a guiding principle, right? So we already have universal space law that is agreed to by nations, and then nations have also signed on to several other agreements, like the Liability Convention, the Rescue Agreement, and so there are these agreements that nations have signed on to. I think the important thing to realize is that when nations are signing on to international space law, and the question is, can that have universal applicability? It really depends on that particular nation to interpret that law and then legislate nationally to implement it. So it's the state's responsibility to implement. For example, the Outer Space Treaty tells you that states are responsible for the activities of private space companies, right? It's not the United Nations. So if a private space company acts rogue, for example, on the moon and goes and claim a particular territory, which is against the Outer Space Treaty, it is not the UN, but that particular state that has to take action because that state is then responsible to the United Nations. So, and so that's that's the way international law actually works. That's the way it worked in other domains, and that's how it works in space as well. So we already have international space law. Nations have agreed to it. We have guiding principles, but in terms of implementation, states take their own national legislative action as well as laws that implement it. Sam, do you?
Yeah. Thanks, Namrata. Yeah, and they might interpret them differently, right? Yeah. And my colleague reminded me that when UN COPUOS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, was negotiating the guidelines for long-term sustainability of space activities, it wasn't until years in the process that they recognized that space safety, security, and sustainability were different concepts because some of the countries were translating them as the same word, right? So you have these, I mean, what does, Japan, for example, interpreted the Outer Space Treaty for the peaceful uses of outer space for a long time, or at least some argue to be non-military, right? Whereas for the U.S., the U.S. space program was always military. I mean, our first satellites were spying nuclear missile fields in the Soviet Union. So these lines are hard, and I think the broader you get with respect to how many countries can you get to agree to something, the less specific it's going to be with respect to what it actually means.
Yeah. While you were talking, I was even thinking about, the Artemis Accords and other efforts to try to obtain consensus in operation in space. Let's go on to the next question. This one's asking about geopolitical rivalries in space. The question is, what are the current geopolitical rivalries in outer space and how do they impact international collaboration?
Well, I can jump first,
Go ahead.
Namrata. I think one of the most important ones is between the United States and China. And I think, it's with the United States and China. China is a country the United States has not collaborated with respect to space. And, going back about 10 years, US or China and Russia started cooperating a lot more in space. And at that point, China had the resources but didn't have the expertise, and Russia had the expertise but not necessarily the resources. And Namrata is going to correct me if I'm wrong on this, because she's really the expert when it comes to China's space program. But now China is really looking to be a global space leader in its own right. And so both the United States and China are trying to develop more and more international space partnerships. And one of the things that I think that's been interesting to watch with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so many countries and companies not wanting to engage with Russia has been to see how China is going to react to this, and how China is going to, whether partnering with Russia on space activities, including things like position, navigation, timing, whether that hurts them for some of their multilateral space cooperative endeavors that they're pursuing, right? And whether that's undermining their goal to be the global space leader. So I think that's an interesting one to watch, not just U.S. v. China, but U.S. and China in trying to build other defense international space partnerships.
Yeah, I'll add to that actually, because James, you mentioned the Artemis Accord. So what is interesting is that the idea for such an accord came up when former Vice President Mike Pence gave a speech in April 2019, where he argued that at that time, China had landed on the far side of the moon. And so his worry was that because of China's strategic culture of claiming territory, the US has to have a program that goes back to the moon. And so there you see a geopolitical strategic alignment structure taking place, where China then went ahead and established its own lunar program called the International Lunar Research Station. So Artemis Accords and the program that has about more than 48 nations that have signed on. And then you have ILRS that also has nations like Pakistan, South Africa, Egypt, that have signed on. So you do have that kind of geopolitical rivalry. I'll finally end by answering the question directly. Does geopolitical contestation affect collaboration? Absolutely. And so as Sam was mentioning, the one thing that we have noticed in terms of China under Xi Jinping and China under Hu Jintao is a very different China. So, and this is noticed even in its geopolitical behavior on Earth. It's a much more assertive nation. It is taking the strategic initiative, not just on Earth, but also in space. It's articulating ambitions of establishing a China-led international order as well as a China-led space order. And then it views Russia as a very important partner. And I think because there is this very clear conceptualization of China becoming the dominant actor and becoming assertive, that challenges the notions of collaboration to an extent.
No, well said, both of you. Here's the next question. It's asking about technologies for sustainability. What new technologies and capabilities are essential to achieving your vision for space sustainability, or the vision that you laid out there?
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly, I have two technologies that I can quickly talk about. I think the one thing that has changed the game in terms of technology for the world is the fact that we can have reusable rockets and not just first stage. The hope is that you can get all stages reusable, right? Which means that the cost comes down. And Starship is succeeding with, I think they'll have the 7th or the 8th test, if I remember, 7th maybe. And so what is happening is that now you have countries like China, India, that have also put out very clear space policies and programs to develop reusable launch. I'll tell you that that's going to be revolutionary if it is not just the US, but if countries in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, for example, I don't know if Japan has a policy like that, but may come up. So reusable launch is going to change the game because like the airline industry, where because of the reuse of airplanes and mass production, the cost of tickets have come down, right? So that's going to be absolutely game changing. The second thing, which I think in terms of technology, which I'm seeing nations getting more and more interested, is the integration of space technology, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing and communication. And nations are starting to talk about that. There are also conversations that we need to move our computing to low Earth orbit or the moon so that it's much more capable in terms of the passage of spectrum or communication, beg your pardon. And so I think that's what is going to be game changing in my mind if in the next few years.
And I'll add just a couple other ideas here. One is, I think, command and control for these large proliferated mega constellations, right? Like this is really a new concept, and we're seeing it happen now. But how that, and I particularly think about this on the defense side. How DoD carries out command and control for these constellations, where in the past they're really looking at small constellations of handful satellites. Now thinking about how do we do this for hundreds of satellites, I think is going to be really challenging and really important. I also think about, SpaceX. We've been talking about SpaceX a lot, but, the autonomous collision avoidance, right? This is going to be more important as space gets busier. I saw the FCC report that SpaceX had done in 6 months, tens of thousands of maneuvers based on when there was a potential risky approach from another satellite. So these kinds of things are going to be more important as we expand to an orbital environment in which we have tens of thousands of satellites, right? Versus, fewer than 10,000 now, or fewer than 1,000 so many years ago, right? Like it's kind of crazy to think how fast the orbital environment has changed. The other, I'll just note that my colleague Marlon Sorge recently wrote about control to reentry, and thinking about how to get rid of your satellite and actually control it as you dispose of it. And that can be really important, driving it down to reorbit, because there's going to be so much activity in lower altitudes. Kind of having control as you try to get that satellite to burn up, right, is going to be really, really critical. So thinking about how, again, so much of this is how do we adapt to this paradigm that we've never had before, where there's just so many more actors and so many more pieces of spacecraft and perhaps debris, right? And so the technologies that I think are going to be really successful are going to be the ones that help us navigate that. And to me, command and control, autonomous collision avoidance, and then thinking about how to dispose in a way where you have more control are going to be valuable.
You're talking about the disposal of satellites and things made me flash back to the 70s, talking with colleagues about when Space Lab was crashing to the Earth, and how concerned everybody was. We certainly need better plans than that. Let's take it to the next one. The next one is asking us about building consensus on space policy. Which institution or framework is best suited to build consensus on global space policy? That's assuming perhaps there is even one. But Namrata, how about you take us off on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I teach space policy. So when we think about space policy and the missions that nations basically build or prioritize, they're very domestic level, right? So a nation would decide that I don't need to build launch, I can buy launch, right? So what I need to build is a satellite that will help me in the ISR capability I need for my region. The United Arab Emirates is an example. They don't have a launch capability. They launch from Japan. So space policy is very much directed at the national level, and within that, you have different stakeholders. Governments build the policy. Now, the global level, what you can see if we talk about global space policy, something that is that cannot be enforced by law, but that can act as either can become regulation or can act as guidance. You have the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Space in the United Nations. So that's one body that can work towards building policies that are globally agreed to and consulted on, for example, on an anti-satellite moratorium, or for example, on space sustainability, responsibility, guidelines for how do you navigate, for example, space debris. And then, of course, you have you have the Conference on Disarmament that very much focuses on space security. Your dialogue is called Conversations Shaping Security. And so they actually shape the discourse around space security. So while COPUOS does talk about, the counter space capability, it's the Conference on Disarmament that focus directly on issues of space security. So there is some level of global space policy making going on, but I would argue that, and I'll end there, that when I think about space, there are three levels of analysis and policy. One is the domestic level, where nations decide that I need a space program and I need it for this particular purpose and this mission and this activity. Could be national security. Russia is very much focused on national security. China now is talking a lot about economic development, and so is India. National security forms a part of that, right? Then you have the regional level, where you have regional bodies that think about how do we build better regional structures that will enable some level of consensus so that we can have stability. Nations care a lot about stability. And at the highest level is the global entities that basically direct, guide, and nations agree to. So.
Sam, did you want to close out on that last question?
Nothing to add. That was great.
Okay. This may be our last question then, but and it actually picks up where you were speaking, Namrata, but it's about balancing these national and global interests. So how can nations balance their strategic and commercial interests in space while promoting shared global benefits and sustainability? And Sam, how about we start with you, and we'll go over to Namrata to close that one out.
Yeah, thanks. And I think there's just such a compelling argument for countries to want to collaborate and develop things collectively in space, right? Like, I mean, when we're looking at what a country Y should do, right? You can think there are the capabilities it should build purely itself. There are the capabilities it should build with other countries. And then there are the capabilities that it can just buy things that exist or use things that exist, right? Like buy commercial services. And the more that you can do in those latter categories, the more you're going to be able to extract from space, right? The more that you just have to build everything from scratch that you want to use, that's going to be really expensive, and it's going to limit what you can do for space. And that includes the United States, which has the biggest space budget, right? So the more that, I think there's just such a need for the kinds of models. I mentioned the U.S. Norway hosted payload example, what's happening with U.S. and Japan. I just think, one of the crazy things to me is that hasn't been done more in the past, right? I think we really need to see that. And I think one of the reasons we didn't is because space was dominated by Soviet Union and the United States, right? But now you have, especially in the Indo-Pacific, tying this back to APRSAF, right? You have so much activity happening in the Indo-Pacific. I think there's such a compelling need for countries to really think about how can we develop this in a way that benefits both our countries, and we split the cost, and we use the expertise in both countries, and we use the geography in both countries, right? I just think, and then you think about that not just on a governmental level, but also thinking about it on a government commercial level, right? Like this is just something that really makes sense. And so I hope we see more of it.
Namrata.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll start with the challenge to that question, and then I'll end with the way that we can come to some level of collaboration, which is the focus of the question. So I think one way that space is viewed as such a national security asset is because space is. Space enables force projection, space enables command and control, space enables missile tracking, missile deployment. We saw that during the Gulf War and following that. And so nations, especially countries like China, India, Russia, Japan, are thinking about that, South Korea today. And so I think that aspect is extremely important. So in case there is an escalation of conflict in a particular regional theater, space plays a role in terms of mapping that theater, providing the intelligence, tracking. So a nation is incentivized to target those space assets, right? And that's where collaboration can sometimes be challenged, which is also the case, for example, with other domain, but it's really unique in space because there is that once you destroy something in space, it can also destroy it for others because you create debris. So that's something nations are thinking through. I think in terms of, if I want to add on collaboration, I think what I'm noticing is that nations around the world, China started this trend, had declared space assets as critical infrastructure. So when they declared that, what they meant is that space is vital for the economic development of their society. And if another nation challenges or targets their space assets, they will be seeing that they didn't say act of war, but see it at a very high level of security. And India is starting to talk about that because populations that are so large and so much populations in the world now really depend on space for financial transaction, timing, navigation. And so because that is happening, I think states are constituted as such that they do care about how their citizens can take advantage of a particular technology. And because of that, they will be incentivized to collaborate to the extent possible on ensuring that their space assets remain, at least not threatened when it's not a conflict, and also that their citizens are able to access it. So I think that could lead to some level of collaboration.
Yes. Well, thank you so very much, Namrata, Sam, and Al, for joining us today on Dialogue. As we conclude today's episode, it's clear that securing a sustainable future for space requires urgent action and a shared commitment to responsible practices. The challenges are significant, but so are the opportunities for collaboration and innovation. These conversations shape security. Join us on December 16th for Dialogue 34, Sri Lanka's Tide Turns. Professor Shyam Takwani and I will explore Sri Lanka's historic November 14th election and its potential to reshape the nation's future, tackling governance, reconciliation, economic reform, and regional impact. From all of us at DKI APCSS, thank you for joining this important conversation. I'm James Minnich. Until we meet again, aloha oi. As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.